Every sailor remembers their first trip offshore, how the swells lift and roll as regular as a whale's heartbeat, how the land gets small and the waves can get very, very large, and how a bunch of little things add up to peace of mind or apprehension, depending on how well you did your preparation. No one knew this better than Captain George Vancouver, the first to sail completely around Vancouver Island in 1792. The island is the largest on the northwest coast of North America, and the sea voyage around it, starting from south of Seattle and back again, is about 800 nautical miles. So my wife Wendy and I decided to circumnavigate Vancouver Island and see how the experience compared to Vancouver's epic voyage.
Let's go some more.
It took us almost a year to get ready.
Whoa, right there.
We've had offshore experience on other people's boats and knew some of the conditions we might encounter. But it'd be the first time it'd be just us on our own boat.
Ready?
Even in the summer months, the North Pacific can test sailors' boats and equipment. Ed and I found our dream boat and were restoring the 45-foot Fastnet sloop, a Luther's design built by LeCompte in Holland. Integrity's a classic racer cruiser, comfortable and fast, but there's no getting around the fact that she's 25 years old, and we needed to make substantial improvements before we could sail safely around the island.
One thing kept leading to another. And then the engine died. The venerable old diesel had given all she could. To repower was a big job that took equipment and people who really knew what they were doing.
Happy days!
Meanwhile, I was learning way more than I wanted to know about boat wiring and plumbing.
Oh, cruising? Cruising is working on your boat in exotic locations.
Get to know your boat. Pull wire through it for a couple of days. In the end, we had replaced the engine, rudder, steering cable, VHF radio, radar, Loran for GPS, autopilot, and the instruments.
There's not much historical record remaining of George Vancouver. One portrait, 2 charts, and his journals. They tell of an island he was first to sail a ship around on the northwest coast of North America. And they tell of his mission to recover land and property taken from a British citizen by the Spanish at Friendly Cove on Nootka Sound. Nootka Sound is where ships from every seafaring country in the world came to trade with the legendary Chief Maquina for sea otter pelts that could sell for 1,000% profit in China. Until the Spanish evicted Maquina and seized 4 British trade ships, Friendly Cove had been considered a neutral zone.
We were curious to see how our adventure compared to Vancouver's. For openers, he had considerably more crew, 134 in all, and 2 ships, the Chatham, a 53-foot armed tender under the command of Lieutenant William Broughton, and the Discovery, a 96-foot, 337-ton sloop of war rigged for close-in surveying work. We would sail double-handed, with friends and family joining us along the way. Integrity is 45 feet on deck and weighs 12 tons to Discovery's 337. He stowed his provisions in barrels. We made a trip to Costco. On July 15th, we headed out.
We left our home port in Tacoma, Washington, and headed north, up Puget Sound. At the south end of Vashon Island, we sailed by the replica of Gray's Lady Washington. It was from Gray that Vancouver learned Friendly Cove was probably on an island, not the mainland. On most of the charts at the time, the Pacific Northwest was a blank that Vancouver, a meticulous surveyor, would fill in.
We shared the ebb through Covos Passage with a tug pulling a log raft. Puget Sound was named for Lieutenant Peter Puget, who charted the shoreline south of Bainbridge Island. We were following in their wake, but we had to dodge Seattle traffic.
It sure didn't seem like July as we approached the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Early seafarers called the Pacific Northwest the land of mist for its fogs and damp and rain. The few who ventured north of California were looking for the Northwest Passage, a mythical seaway between the Pacific and Atlantic, depicted on 16th century charts as the Strait of Anian. Like many good sea stories of the time, Sir Francis Drake was involved. In 1578, Drake attacked the Spanish fleet in Mexico, taking away a large fortune in gold bullion and any feelings of Spanish superiority in the Pacific. He sailed north, charting the coastline, searching for the fabled shortcut back to England. All he found was vile and stinking fogs. After claiming all the northern coasts for the Queen of England, Drake sailed west and home. The Spanish believed that they owned all the lands washed by the Pacific. When Drake didn't return, they feared he had found the Strait of Anian. Juan de Fuca, a Greek pilot, claimed that the Spanish had hired him to find the passageway and secure it for Spain. And he had done exactly that, he said, sailing into the passage that he had located at 48 degrees north latitude. It seems remarkable to be reading these names from our computer screen with fixes bounced off a satellite. We were glad to be sailing across the traffic lanes in the 21st century with radar to see freighters through the vile and stinking fog. The U.S. and Canada have thoughtful services for sailors, like the CAN Pass.
Yeah, our vessel number is 552876. Vessel's name is Integrity.
Ed was able to clear customs by phone with a number he set up before sailing. As we crossed the line into British Columbia, I hoisted the Canadian flag and thought, if it hadn't been for Vancouver, I might be hoisting a Spanish flag.
Friends on Ahi, another Luder's design, sailed with us through the Gulf Islands. In the afternoon, you start looking for a place to drop the hook. On this trip, we stayed in the De Courcy group, just south of Dodd Narrows.
It's beautiful here, Ed. We're here. We're in Canada. We're anchored and we're actually on our holiday. In Canada, a vacation is called a holiday. So we're on holiday because we're learning to speak Canadian on our way around Vancouver Island.
The next morning, we left in time to go through the Narrows at high slack tide. Danger reefs. And, we're about 6 miles south of Dodd Narrows. Just going to check and see what it's going to look like. This is our tide and current program. Just looking at the current predictions for Dodd Narrows. We're going to be there in about an hour. The narrow passages are tricky, but the trick is to time the tide so that you approach just at the end of the flood. Push into it, and then when the tide ebbs, you ride it through. Tide lines gather debris, and not all of it is on the surface. You can see how strong the tides and currents can be in this latitude, especially through these narrow passageways.
Can I just hold my course?
Yeah, I'd put the pedal down.
Another factor is that everyone else is going through at the same time you are, so you have to keep an eye on the traffic coming and going.
Shoreline is going by, but really
Very
kind of
slowly.
slowly. You are making it.
The reward for successfully navigating Dodd Narrows is arriving at Nanaimo. It's a booming city geared toward people having a good time on the water. What a great idea. Boatside service.
We have a multi-grain bread for $2.75, and we also have a whole wheat bread for $1.75.
The multi-grain sounds very good. Made today?
Yeah, it was baked this morning.
Nanaimo is one of 3 places on Vancouver Island where we picked up and dropped off friends and family to sail part of the way. Campbell River and Port McNeill at the north end of the island also had good highway and bus connections. On the mainland, Pender Harbor and Lund have worked out well for rendezvous. Sailing in the company of others is a tradition in these waters.
This is the chart Vancouver gave the king that shows his expedition's track through Puget Sound and then north. Here, near present-day Vancouver, British Columbia, they found the Soodle and the Mexicana. Vancouver's orders were to cooperate with Spanish ships engaged in exploration and survey work, so the explorers sailed north together to survey the Strait of Georgia and Desolation Sound.
Ahi was picking up friends and pulled anchor the next morning.
Wasn't the most comfortable.
But we got to spend an extra day exploring the reefs around Newcastle Island Marine Park.
Ooh. Water's warm.
British Columbians are to be praised for how much they do to keep their beautiful land in its natural state.
Now this is an unusual crab. He seems to be walking straight forward.
Here a person can look into tide pools all afternoon and see how wind and waves carve rock into fantastic shapes.
Here's the mouth. There's the nose kind of coming out over the mouth, and there's an eye, and there's an eye. Ah, it's monster rock.
This is Area Whiskey Gulf. We left Nanaimo just before high tide to cross the Strait of Georgia, Vancouver's tribute to King George. These days we still pay tribute to the government by avoiding Area Whiskey Gulf, a torpedo testing range. We checked the VHF that morning and Area Whiskey Gulf was active, so we motored north to the Bolinas Islands to clear the range. Then we hoisted sail and had a great run toward the islands of Desolation Sound.
Water, we got fuel, we got gasoline for the outboard. We're ready to rock and roll.
The Copeland Islands Marine Park is just around the corner from Desolation Sound. We anchored in the first bay. We've called this Singer Bay ever since pulling up a Singer sewing machine with our anchor a few years back.
The goal line is our main anchor line, and we seem to have it stuck in some rock. And then we put down the white line to try to retrieve the gold line. And we got it stuck too.
Luckily, Lund is only a dinghy ride away. Lund is one of the nicest places you could ask for to wait out any dilemma. It's the beginning and end of Highway 101, a friendly and popular jump-off spot to Desolation Sound. By noon, everyone in town was helping us look for a diver, So we stopped for chowder and a brew at the Lund Hotel. It was served up with a ghost story.
One time, about 3:30 in the morning, the housekeeper came in, and there was knives and forks flying around the kitchen. And every time she goes up there, she feels a presence.
It wasn't the Lund ghost who conjured up our rescue team the next morning. It was the Lund harbor master who sent the Powell River divers. The Powell River divers in the distance. They'd been working on the new launch ramp in Lund, and for a fee we were happy to pay, retrieved our anchor.
Local scuttlebutt was that a ship had been deliberately sunk in Singer Bay for the insurance, and maybe a Spanish galleon.
Packer. Packing boat.
Down out in here.
You know, I know one went down over here.
Oh, did it?
Our anchor was down 70 feet, tangled in the wreck of a sunken ship.
We're going to move today. That'll be nice.
Under the cross in Singer Bay is where the ghost ship lies. Could it be a galleon? We didn't want to know. We were just glad to be free. This is what Vancouver called Desolation Sound.
It must have been raining for days when Vancouver named Desolation Sound, because in any other weather, it's a place of beautiful water, gorgeous scenery, prolific wildlife, especially birds, and it's a cruising paradise. Our children joined us for a few days, and we revisited some favorite spots and did some favorite things in and around Desolation Sound.
Fill the world with light. See her people smiling. There is power and there is magic in your dreams. Watch her turning slowly. She shines just like a jewel. And if we pull together, we can see her through.
We took friends with us and followed the flock to Middle Natch Island Nature Park. Bird heaven. It's about a 2-hour sail from Desolation Sound, depending upon your location. The southeast corner of the island offers a little cove where you can anchor overnight inside a raucous rookery of migratory birds. The last few years we've anchored instead off the North Beach, which is also nice in settled weather, and dinghy to shore. Naturalist volunteers take turns caretaking.
Your job is to clean the beaches, to monitor the visitors, count boats, count people, but mostly just to protect the environment. We write in thoughts, memories, and anything important. We change the propane on the stove, or we chase people off the bluff, or whatever. And so Tyler took a turn yesterday writing in about Middle Natch, and he wrote a great poem about his feelings about Middle Natch. So he'll read you that.
Called Middle Natch. Middle Natch is as beautiful as can be, surrounded by the sea. Many birds call this place their home. In the meadows they do roam. Up the hill at the blind, many birds you can find. Many boats come in the bay. They let this place, so they stay. I really have enjoyed staying at this place for the birds. It has lots of space. I have to say goodbye now, but I hope to return somehow.
Good, Tyler.
It was time for us to say goodbye to Middle Natch too, and to Desolation Sound. It was late July, and we needed to keep moving north. We restocked our fresh food and good Canadian beer supply in Campbell River. Gale force winds were making it uncomfortable at the dock, while we waited for a favorable tide to go through Seymour Narrows.
A little blue over there. There's about a 1-foot chop coming across the marina basin. That's the topping lift. I've tried. I've worked on it every day. Seymour Narrows tomorrow, I hope, if the weather is decent.
Over 200 years earlier, Vancouver waited for the return of William Johnstone. Johnstone had been sent up channel to see if there was a way for the ships to go through. Days after his supplies had run out, Johnstone returned. Yes, there was a way.
Campbell River is base camp for North Vancouver Island. This is where the tides change direction and start ebbing north through Queen Charlotte Strait, rather than south through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. 14 to 16-foot tides squeeze through constricted passages, where infamous rapids like Seymour Narrows test your boat and how well you did your calculations. To add to its nasty reputation, Seymour Narrows had a hull-ripping rock right in the middle of the passage, just beneath the surface. Ripple Rock wrecked many a ship and drowned their crew. After many failed attempts to remove the rock, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came at it from below, tunneling under the channel, drilling up into the rock and filling it with dynamite. Photographer Cordy Wagner captured the world's largest non-nuclear explosion when Ripple Rock was vaporized on April 5, 1958. It was one less thing to worry about as we slipped out of our moorage to ride a huge ebb north.
Here we go.
The Chatham Point Light marks the elbow where you leave Discovery Passage and enter Johnstone Strait. It's the halfway point up the inside and a place of change where the water temperature drops 10 to 15 degrees and the tides rise another 2 feet to reach 18 feet or more. Friends on West Wind, a Hunter 37, joined us on this lake. Like the tide, our weather was now coming from the north, down a 54-mile chute with mountain ranges on both sides. My dad was a pilot who always had a place picked out where he could set her down in a pinch. We do much the same thing on the boat. We always have a safe spot picked out that changes as we move along, a place you can duck into if conditions get ugly.
Small Inlet is a good hidey hole. Integrity draws about 7 feet. I have to make sure we enter and leave on high tide. A little further north, Chameleon Harbor is very protected in a blow from the south. But if the wind swings north, it changes. There's a reason they call it Chameleon Harbor. We were up and moving before dawn, but there are rewards. Our own private eclipse. We were working our way north between a series of lows that swept past one after the other. Sea conditions changed with the tide. What was tolerable when the current was going in the same direction as the wind became intolerable once that changed. We adopted the common wisdom of going north with the ebbs and anchoring with the floods. We've heard good things about Port Neville, and we've used Port Harvey as a stopover along the way. Port Harvey has one of the more spectacular pictographs nearby, the Tree of Life. We enjoy finding these treasures and read every guide we can get our hands on. The really good info seems to come from other cruisers. Near the north end of Johnstone Strait, a hydrophone and a solar-powered transmitter broadcast underwater sounds on 88.5 FM. It's Radio Orca from Robeson's Bight.
36.
Provincial park rangers filled us in on the popular program.
By listening to a hydrophone or something like the Orca FM, you can tell exactly which pods are in the area.
Once they come down the strait near Robson Bight, they usually use the reserve for quite a bit. At least a couple times a day if they're around.
Why did they come here?
Maybe the rubbing beaches. There's a few beaches along the reserve that have a certain shape of stone. It's very smooth, very round, and the whales like to kind of go up and rub their bellies on it. We're not quite sure what it means. It might be just like a belly rub. It might be to get rid of parasites or that kind of thing, but we're not quite sure. But it's a pretty vulnerable time for them, so we try to protect that area and keep odors away from them as much as possible.
We turned right out of Johnstone Strait into Blackney Pass and Blackfish Sound before heading toward one of the 100 hidden anchorages washed by Queen Charlotte Strait. From our angle, Whitefish Passage looked like a dead end.
My heart's working good.
Then the narrow, rocky waterway opened up as we moved through into Indian Channel. We sounded our way back into the inlet and dropped the hook. In these islands, it's easy to slip back in time and imagine what once was.
The next morning, we followed kayakers through the Indian group of islands to Mamalilakula, once the winter village of the Kwakiutl tribe. Tom Seawood greets visitors who come to learn about the village of the last potlatch.
When people come to our villages and our ceremonies, out of respect, we greet them in our traditional regalia, our aprons, our button blankets, and our headpieces, and we welcome them in our language. So carrying on the tradition to you, Kela Kasla, Mamliachla Kwikwasidanook Mimkwamlis. Welcome from the Mamliachla and the Kwikwasidanook, two of the tribes or bands that used to inhabit this village.
Archaeological evidence suggests that Vancouver Island has been continuously inhabited since 2,000 years BC. The first people lived very well by any standard, with summer and winter villages in an environment rich with food, property, arts, and slaves.
One house over here, the chief probably acquired his wealth through slavery. His house was unique. Everyone else had a dirt floor. His house had a wood floor 6 feet off the ground, and on each corner outside the house underneath was a carving 6 feet high of a slave holding his house in place. This is the last remaining totem pole in the village. When it stood here, like all poles, it stood facing out to sea. Totem poles were carved after a chief died. His family would host a memorial potlatch, and they would raise a pole in his honor.
Tom Seawood's grandfather was a wise and benevolent chief and community leader. Tom continues the tradition. The spirit of the potlatch, a generous spirit, is alive and well.
We had an extra day, so we took the ferry to explore Alert Bay on Cormorant Island. It was time to unfold the bicycles and get some exercise. The cruise ships slow down out in Broughton Strait so that everyone can take a picture of the standing totem poles in the chief's cemetery beside the sea. Native arts and more recent cultural impacts are celebrated in wood and stained glass, where the fisher of men is at the wheel of a purse seiner, and the faithful are brought near in a seaplane. It looks peaceful here, but these waters can surprise you. There are rocks in places you don't expect them, and it's important to pay attention to your charts. Both the Chatham and Discovery went aground in Queen Charlotte Strait, but Vancouver was able to float them off on the next high tide. We left on the last of the flood for God's Pocket, a legendary dive resort.
What we've got here, in our opinion, is the best in the world. Mm-hmm. We have truly magnificent life underwater, and it's our idea to get more people to see what it is, in fact, to respect it.
It was an opportunity for us to check out a persistent rumor we'd heard about Hearst Island.
Yeah. So now, tell us about the Sasquatch.
Where do we go? There is a Sasquatch on Hearst Island. We've seen his footprints.
Actually, the legend in the books of what we've read and been told is that in history, there was the sighting of a hairy Sasquatch, but on the other side of the island, Harlequin Bay, And the Indians that were living on these islands were afraid spiritually about this hairy man that they saw, and therefore wouldn't come to these islands anymore.
Someday we want to spend a whole summer exploring these islands, but this time we were committed to going over the top. Bull Harbor is where almost every cruiser waits for the weather and tide to come together. We anchored in the inner harbor near a native canoe tied to the former government dock. The First Nation now owns the former Coast Guard station, and you need to get their permission to land and explore Hope Island. It was a secure place for last-minute double-checking. A red sky at night confirmed the weather forecasts and the rising barometer. We left Bull Harbor at dawn. The ideal tide is an early morning flood to cross Nawitty Bar that changes about an hour and a half out to sweep you around Cape Scott on the ebb. Or so we'd read. Now it was time for some first-hand experience.
Oh, kind of a little anxiety, but it's not bad. It's pretty smooth so far. There's a light flashing on the southwest tip of Hope Island, and we're about to round it. Head out into the Pacific.
The butterflies were starting to settle down, and so was I, as we sailed over the top of Vancouver Island. Nawitty Bar, the shallow slide into Queen Charlotte Sound, was easy on us this morning. I could see how this stretch could be one wild ride in poor conditions. We moved out into more open water, and Integrity was taking the big rollers in stride. So were we. On other offshore trips, Wendy and I have both had a brush with seasickness, but we tend to be lucky in this regard. Some time at the wheel, looking at the horizon, or lying down and taking a nap will almost always ease the symptoms. I clipped into safety harness to go forward and hoist the mainsail.
I need to go release the main halyard.
Under sail at last. We relaxed and watched Cape Scott and the Scott Islands come out of the fog. The Cape Scott Light is further inland than you expected, but there it was.
Made a kick in another 5 to the left.
We soon headed off our port rail and could begin the turn south. The sea turned a darker blue as the Pacific swells coming in all the way from China lifted our boat. The motion was calming and exhilarating. Integrity was designed and built for these conditions. It was great to see her go to work. The prevailing northwesterlies gave us a nice ride past Hansen Lagoon, and in almost less time than it takes to tell about it, we turned into San Joseph Bay to stand off the entrance to Sea Otter Cove. Another sailboat was threading its way out of the tricky entrance. He was smaller and drew 2 less feet than we did. The owner said he'd touched bottom a couple of times. He advised us to wait until the tide had come in, a few more feet. Good advice, and we followed it, going into San Joseph Bay to wait it out.
San Joseph Bay is too open for an overnight stay, but for a sunny afternoon it's perfect. There are wide sand beaches, a river delta, and a garden of sea-sculptured rock formations to investigate. A camper told us that a road now comes within 3 kilometers of the beach. A few hours later, we made the entrance to Sea Otter Cove. What a day! A successful rounding of Cape Scott and a secure anchorage. Life is good.
Imagine you're a traveler from a distant galaxy. twinkle in the sky, so high above. And with a single syllable, an ordinary word, you could heal the hearts of darkness with your love. Fill the world with light, see her people smiling. There is power and there is magic in your dreams. Watch her turning slowly, she shines just like a jewel. And if we pull together, we can see her through.
Once hunted to near extinction, the sea otters are returning to the west coast of Vancouver Island.
The 40 nautical miles to Quatsino Sound should have been a pleasant sail downwind, but our wind had changed. It was now coming on the nose at 20 to 25 knots, with gusts to 30, and pushing up a nasty chop. We approached between Cape Parkins and Quacutal Point, and soon rounded the Quatsino Lighthouse on Carnes Island.
It was great to stop thrashing around. We motored up Forward Inlet and were happy to see the calm waters of Winter Harbor. Local rumor had it that Vancouver spent the winter here, but his charts and reports show otherwise. In any event, it's a great anchorage, protected from all directions. Winter Harbor was once served only by water, and people got around on an island ferry system that ran a regular route up and down the coast. Passengers walked the boardwalk to the summer cottages and homes and took the boat when they wanted to go somewhere else. Today, a dirt road connects to a gravel power line road that connects Winter Harbor to the rest of the island, and many of the buildings along the boardwalk stand empty. Things change, even here.
We had to run the Quatsino Narrows into Cole Harbor because we'd heard so much about it.
We just saw a tug go through ahead of us, make the turn and head up Quatsino Narrows, so I think we'll be okay. We're about an hour before slack.
By now, we were becoming old hands at running rapids.
It's a pretty big flood. Take a look at the GPS and see how many knots we're doing now. We're doing about 14 knots.
We're scooting.
Good ride.
Cole Harbor's mine closed a few years back, and the fishing fleet sat in port waiting for a fishing season that never arrived. Too many fishing boats and La Nina equals too few salmon this year. We hope new economies will replace the old ones that are passing away. We stopped in Pamphlet Cove and Julian Cove, snug anchorages along Quatsino Sound where deer graze in the meadows and sunsets ripple off the waves. On the way back, we crossed a tide line, heard a thunk, and the prop started to vibrate severely.
Whales are not...
Integrity limped into Winter Harbor, where we got lucky. There was a diver on the boat in front of us. Within a minute or two, our problem was solved.
That's the majority of it. Red cedar bark.
It's great how cruisers help each other. Thank you, Pacific Voyager. It was a happy ending, but the experience gave us a late start out of Quatsino Sound, and by now the southwesterly winds had picked up some serious punch. Then the barometer took a nosedive, and Environmental Canada, the weather station, broke in with a weather alert. Another low was moving in fast, south of the Charlottes. I put a reef in the main and headed for a bulletproof blowhole we'd read about just north of the Brooks Peninsula.
You don't go into this one, or this one, or this one. But you do go into this one.
The passage into Claskish Basin is behind door number 3.
Here's the little passage.
Where the true passage opens at the last minute into a narrow, tree-lined corridor. After we found it, we showed another sailboat the way in to the 8 government buoys, and then hunkered down to wait out the storm. It was 3 days and 3 nights of rain. We spent our time exploring, sleeping, reading, and trying to get wet wood to burn. Claskish Basin's steep walls protected us from the worst of the weather, but also blocked out radio reception.
The electronics that got us into Claskish Basin quit on the way out, the morning we left to go around the Brooks Peninsula. This is one of the most challenging legs of our trip, and now even more so. The Brooks Peninsula juts 9 miles out into the Pacific, like a belligerent gesture. Unique life forms that escaped the last ice age cling to the remote and difficult terrain, where 2,500-foot peaks catch the moisture from almost constant cloud cover to nurture an ancient forest. Cape Cook on the northwest corner is known to have the highest velocity of winds anywhere on this coast. We gave ourselves plenty of room around Solander Island and beat south toward warmer and more protected waters.
It's gotten kind of lumpy out here. Probably as a result of the Brooks Peninsula. It always seems to be stormy and rough around the Brooks Peninsula. All the Great Capes. So we're gonna do 3 Great Capes. This little John, Cape Scott, Cape Cook, and Cape Flattery. 2 down and 1 to go.
We passed by a dozing whale, a young one. It was great to see, but worrisome that we didn't see him until he was alongside. A collision would cause serious damage to both of us.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? First time I've seen a humpback. First time I've ever seen one.
The approach to Cayucet Sound is one of the most difficult on the west coast. There were rocks to the left of me and rocks to the right of me, and not much in the way of navigational aids or landmarks to go by.
It may be ugly, but it's beautiful day.
I got our charting program working.
It works.
Using a lot of duct tape and our backup GPS. Don't throw away those paper charts.
Walters Cove was a quiet haven after a long and eventful day. We tied up to the government dock in Cayucet, a town divided by water into reservation and non-reservation neighborhoods. You can find a store and a restaurant along the boardwalk, but no alcohol. Cayucet is a dry town by community agreement. Dry in that sense of the word, anyway. It had been raining for 5 days straight. To us, dry was just a memory. Cayucet is another island village that boomed in the fishing economy years, but today the cannery is closed. Some houses are empty, and everyone wonders what the future will bring. I was getting more excited the closer we got to Nootka Sound, Vancouver's destination. We were taking our time exploring the coastline that was first charted by Europeans using sextants and lead lines. Just outside Dixie Cove in Cayucet Sound, we spotted a Canadian hydrographic survey vessel anchored in a web of cables.
Transform.
Pete Milner, hydrographer in charge, showed us how they're making charts today.
From which direction. This is part of a general re-scheming of the coast. We started a number of years ago around the Tofino area. Once we were established here and we've put in a tide gauge, we'll then go out and start sounding. Beginning of July, our crew showed up and took over, and we're doing the inside west, and the outside here.
The age-old process of making charts has become high-tech, with aerial photographs pin-registered to GPS coordinates, integrated to a new view of the Earth itself.
Canadian charts are generally on two datums. All the old charts, before, say, 1985, are on a datum called North America datum 1927.
Dave Thornhill is the 2IC.
That surveyors felt should be readjusted because the ellipsoid didn't best represent the Earth. So in the mid-80s, they decided to come up with a new datum, and it's called NAD 83. And the difference between the two in horizontal difference in this area is about 225 meters.
225 meters means a variation of over 700 feet between where you are and where your GPS says you are.
Oh yeah, right here. Right here, there's a note here saying horizontal datum, North America datum 1927, NAD 27. Positions on NAD 83 must be moved 0.66 seconds northward and 5.45 seconds eastward to agree with this chart. So if your GPS receivers on NAD 83, any coordinates you take off a NAD 27 chart, you would have to apply that correction to. But the best way around it is just put your GPS receiver on NAD 27, and then you don't have to apply any corrections to your chart.
The weather had changed again, and this time for the better. We came out of Cayucot Sound on a golden morning with our GPS set on NAD 83. Yes, I checked.
Hey, the wind's not blowing 40 knots. It's amazing.
We've gotten into the habit of coming out with one reef in the main and then adjusting sails to the weather. This morning was calm enough to take the shortcut through Clear Passage. We soon shook the reef out of the main. We picked our way carefully past Nipple Rock and Grogan's Rock. I wanted to leave plenty of room between Integrity's hull and the random rocks that make up the barrier islands. Sailing in tight quarters makes us grateful for good charts and the people who make them. The sun burned through the clouds and the wet hills steamed as we made our way south, getting closer by the hour to Nootka Sound. There were towering mounds of white over the mainland behind us and ahead, almost obscuring Nootka Island.
Oh my gosh.
On the other side was Friendly Cove, Vancouver's destination. His chart shows Discovery's approach from the north, the same track we were sailing. And he must have looked out to a similar view, watching the island appear out of the mist. Esperanza Inlet is the back door into Nootka Sound. With the main pushed out, Integrity reached up the inlet in a warm following wind. We ghosted past Esperanza Mission, one of the few settlements along this stretch of water. Aside from green squares on the hillside in various stages of reforestation, the land and sea haven't changed much in thousands of years.
Esperanza Inlet is the northern boundary of Nootka, or more properly, Nuuchanoth Territory, an Aboriginal name meaning all along the mountains. On the other side of Esperanza Narrows was Tassos, the winter village of their most famous chief, Maquinna. Maquinna and his people prospered, and then soured on trading with Europeans. In revenge, they captured an American trading vessel and burned it to the waterline. John R. Jewett, the blacksmith, was spared to become a slave to the man he called King Maquinna.
The king, seeing I was desirous of learning their language, took great pleasure in conversing with me, saying he bore no ill will to my countrymen, but had several times been treated ill by them. 4 chiefs had been barbarously killed by Captain Martinez, a Spaniard.
Then we were in Cook Channel and Nootka Sound, where you could almost feel the presence of Captains Cook, Bligh, Quadra, and Vancouver, standing their square riggers up the Sound. To drop anchor at last in the open arms of Friendly Cove.
Once the anchor is set, we like to take the dinghy out for a look around. So we went a short distance around the corner to Santa Gertrudis Cove. Chief Maquinna gave the English trader John Mears permission to build a ship here, and a small cabin for his workmen to spend the winter in. They built the Northwest America, one of 4 ships seized by the same Captain Martinez, who renamed it the Santa Gertrudis. The hot-headed Spaniard brought Vancouver and 2 British warships halfway around the world to challenge Spain's authority in the Pacific Northwest. A momentous past for such a quiet little cove. Back in Friendly Cove, we found ourselves between friends on Aventure, a Tayana 37, and Icicle, a Roberts 44. As the sun went down, we gathered to swap sea stories and laugh and lift rum drinks to the cruising life.
In the morning, we paid $10 to tie up to the native dock and climb the hill to a territorial view of Friendly Cove and Yuquat, Maquina's summer village. The white frame church at the top of the hill is adorned with beautiful native art. And several memorials to remind visitors of the events that shaped North American history. The fateful meeting between the British and Spanish captains has been immortalized in stained glass. Quadra and Vancouver and Maquina are all there, looking out over the place they all, at one time or another, claimed as their own.
Foghorns at the Nootka Light Station announced the afternoon fog bank. We'd had our 3 days of good weather, and rain was on the way. We decided to make a run for it.
Vancouver sailed on to Hawaii and returned the next spring to chart the entire coastline to the Bering Sea. We sailed on to join our friends at Hot Springs Cove.
The sailboat I was overtaking turned out to be the Estevan Point Light. A few hours later, we were making the entrance to Hot Springs Cove, to anchor with the fishing boats between the park on one side and a native settlement across the bay.
Rain caught up with us, and it was my turn to bail out the dinghy. Near the public dock and store, Chief Maquina's name is carved. The Hot Springs Provincial Marine Park is dedicated to his memory. Robert Aston's name is also memorialized in cedar. Aston built the amazing boardwalk, a sculptural work of art ornamented with the names of yachts that have made the journey around the island. It's an honor that took us an afternoon and a Swiss Army knife to confer upon our boat. So here we are, part of the boardwalk at Hot Springs Cove. Pretty cool, eh? The almost magical boardwalk winds 1.5 miles through the forest, over bogs and changes in elevation, to finally arrive at a small inlet where steaming hot, cedar-colored water flows down a rock face into a sharp ravine filled with boulders, and then spills out to sea. George Vancouver's name is carved on a much grander scale, on the island itself. A generous man, he proposed the name Quadra and Vancouver's Island, and it appeared that way on his chart and in his journal, published shortly after his return to England. But it didn't stick. Vancouver and the British got the credit for discovering the Pacific Northwest, and the Spanish claims began to ebb away.
As we moved south, the weather was improving. We had a nice sail to Barkley Sound. Ucluelet is on the north side of the sound. It has a busy waterfront with public docks and commercial wharves and a big fishing industry. As we'd seen before, most of the commercial fleet was tied up at the docks.
I wanted more time to explore, but time is what we were rapidly running out of. Home and work start developing mass and gravity when you get too close to the end of a vacation. They were reeling us in. We crossed through the broken group of islands in Pacific Rim National Park to sail up Imperial Eagle Channel to Bamfield, another picturesque boardwalk village on the southern edge of Barkley Sound. You can get to one side of Bamfield by road, but you have to take a boat and then the boardwalk to explore the other side. We left on the last leg of our adventure, sailing watchfully across the shipping lanes, enjoying the multitude of sea life around us. An unexpected guest dropped in for lunch, but said no thanks to cooked rice and fruit. Our bird book identified him as a turnstone and said he was probably looking for a bug under a rock. Now, we didn't have any of those on the menu, so he left to hitch a ride north on an Alaskan-bound freighter.
Then we were in the Strait of Juan de Fuca.
I called in a little while ago and identified ourselves as Seattle traffic.
Ed checked in with vessel control, and they let us know when the big ships were coming through our area. It was comforting to have someone looking out for us and letting us know if anything big was heading our way. We spent our first night back in the U.S. in Nia Bay and woke up the next morning to thick fog. We were on instruments almost all the next day, keeping an eye out for fishing boats we could only see on radar. The fog lifted near Port Angeles to give us a visual reference for the Raycon buoy that was making our radar pulse. I was glad to see farther than our bow as local traffic was picking up.
Now some may talk about the night, I sing about the stars. Sure, I've seen the clouds, but only for the sun. I'll guarantee you this, my friend, we've all been to the end, and yet here we are, the day has just begun. Fill the world with light, see her people smiling, there is power and there is magic in your dreams. Watch her turning slowly, she shines just like a jewel, and if we pull together, we can see her too.
And soon we were past Port Townsend.
We sailed all night. I watched the sun go down, and I watched the sun come up again. I thought about George Vancouver and the beautiful island named for his exploration. I thought about the other stories we came upon that we wished we could follow up, and the inlets that we had passed by that we wished we could follow up. We'd learned a lot of things, the most important being that integrity was seaworthy, and so were we.